You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Okay, we are recording. Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before. I'm Jay Record and this is my father Jake. We are hosting a podcast about Star Trek The Next Generation, exploring its themes, characters, and storylines for the benefit of my son and Jake's grandson, Benjamin Jacob Record, who will hopefully listen to this years down the road. But we're also recording this and putting it out for general enjoyment. Hi Jake, how are you?
I'm good this evening, Jay. Thank you.
So tonight we're talking about Where No One Has Gone Before, Star Trek Season 1, Episode 6, which aired on October 26, 1987. I actually love this episode because it's a really well put together episode that has a lot of interesting things to talk about, especially when it comes to space, time, and thought. We'll be diving into some quantum mechanics here. I think we'll also be talking about warp technology, and we'll be talking about the warp barrier a little bit. We'll be touching on Wesley Crusher again. But
Right.
but before we get started, and touch on maybe some more things that you've noted, um, what did you think of the episode, Dad, and did you enjoy it?
I thought it was good because, again, as you pointed out, the main really theme was with Kaczynski coming on board to try to improve the performance of the warp drive, and it becoming apparent that he really was a charlatan, and he was so arrogant
Mm-hmm.
that he did not realize that this person from a far distant part of the galaxy was actually the one that could, you know, um, have effects on space time related to thought. That as you said, that was really fascinating and so on. And then there were some fun little things during the episode, like they had the chief engineer in this episode was Lieutenant Commander Argyle, which was a
Oh
nod
yeah,
to nod to Scotty. Um,
played by Biff Yeager,
yeah,
which is a great name for an actor.
right. And again, as you mentioned, Wesley Crusher, he's still there solving key problems because he was the one that noted that the Traveler was the one that was causing the phenomenon that they were seeing as they were trying to work with the warp drive. Um, and I thought that was a good line when Worf continued to refer to Crusher as the boy, and at one point, Riker called Wesley, referred to Wesley in the boy, and Wesley says, "My name is Boy. My name is Wesley, Commander Riker." So he stood up to him,
Mm-hmm.
and then just to finish up on the Wesley Crusher comments, it just we've seen in the first episodes of this new series that Wesley Crusher is somehow different and so forth, and the Traveler senses that and knows that and makes the comments about Wesley, comparing him to being a Mozart.
Mm-hmm.
So that was very interesting. And but then beyond that, everything really gets into the whole discussion about the quantum physics, the quantum mechanics of what was going on there.
Yeah. So let's touch on Wesley for a little bit, because he's relatively easy to talk about and get through, but also has some interesting things. Um, I think the writers of the series are already playing up this idea that he is this wonder kid, which is a really interesting idea. I actually looked up kind of examples of child prodigies, which is a little bit of a rare thing.
Mm.
But people like Blaise Pascal, let's see. Oh, in music, of course, there's like Mozart. You know, child prodigies are very, very rare, but when
Mhm.
they come along, they're incredibly special. And the Traveler points out that Wesley has the ability to, like Mozart manipulating music, manipulate space, time, and thought
Mhm.
in a way that enables him to maybe engage the universe, much like um, the Q. But I think the interesting thing here that we don't ever pay attention to in the episode when it comes to Wesley is when the first time like the Traveler is showing him like uh the equations that go into Krasinski's model.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, not did I say Krasinski?
Kozinski, I think it is. You added a R.
Yeah,
That's okay.
Krasinski.
Sure.
Um, when he puts in Krasinski's equations, Wesley actually helps correct them a little bit.
Yes. Yeah. That
So
he.
there's
Yes.
so it's important to note that Wesley already has this kind of like extrasensory perception about space and time on a
Right.
mathematical level that I find it interesting that when we talk about Mozart and his ability to transform music into these wonderful displays of reality, I don't think that we ever consider maybe that's an evolutionary thing, that maybe Wesley, because of humans time and space and our educate, we've touched on in past episodes, the advanced education they all receive now, that maybe Wesley is maybe the Wonder Kid is like an evolutionary output of kind of the environment that they're brought up in.
Well, that's a very interesting thing because you talk about Mozart, being able to manipulate the music, and it's more than just understanding it.
Yes.
It's a mastery of the art that you just can't understand, and that's the same sort of thing that you know Wesley seems to demonstrate. And what made me think of it also is I saw one of the on YouTube. I go on YouTube and see what just pops up every day, every evening as I'm going to bed. And what is it with these 4-year-old kids,
Oh
whether
yeah.
they're Chinese or Korean or American or African
Anywhere at this
American,
point.
anywhere, that can play, Mozart and Chopin when they're 3 or 4 years old? What is the deal with that? What is it in their minds that is allowing them to synthesize the ability to do this?
So I'm a big student of ontology, which is the study into the nature of things.
Hmm.
And one thing that we discuss in ontology is the idea of ontological design. And the
Hmm.
idea is that the things that we design in turn redesign us. So, it's not that we made a hammer to nail nails into a wall to put up a structure. The structure and even the hammer itself, in turn, kind of design how we think and how we use things, and maybe how we can perceive constructing things around us.
Hmm.
So, in ontological design, you know, one thing that we could possibly see happening here is that um, in Mozart's time, having access to musical instruments, musical training, compositional, just the basic ideas of composition, which he excelled in early on from the age of 5, that's a very rare thing to have access to versus today where children have a lot of access to music and musical instruments and because of the internet access to these things. I think it's kind of the evolutionary idea of technology, like reading in a way is a evolutionary act. The book in itself is an evolutionary device.
Hmm.
because beforehand, the only books that were held in people's hands were either by the wealthy or the educated, and the educated were usually the religious leaders of your church. And most of them were reading it in a language that most people didn't understand. So if you were like, our you and our ancestors came from Germany, there was a time where they would go to church and a priest would read to them from the Bible in Latin, but they wouldn't understand it until someone translated into the vernacular German and was able to produce books in the vernacular German to where everyone could suddenly read the Bible, and that caused an evolution in everyone's understanding.
Well, that's a good point, because one of the reasons that the first of all, there wasn't, it was what, the 1450, you had the printing press, so that you didn't have the ability to manufacture
Hmm.
large volumes of books. So the Bibles, the scriptures, were very much limited, and they were controlled by the church and the priest. Uh, Particularly before the Reformation, that was the only, through the priest was the only way that the common folk had access to the gospel and so forth. And the priests could put their personal interpretation in it, so that it was a matter of control, of of the of the uh, uh, faithful, so that once you had, the scriptures, the Bible, able to be printed and then distributed to the masses, so they could read it themselves and think for themselves. I think that, I've read somewhere that that was a key thing in the growth of the Reformation.
Hmm. So, I think one thing that also has to be recognized when we talk about how technology leads to huge social changes
That's
is,
that's that's exactly the point I was making. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, I think one thing that we have to talk about is that there's often a transition that we don't account for, and that's a change of industry.
Hmm.
Like, for example, like, I'm in publishing, so I really know a lot about books and the history of books. At some point, you know, monasteries and priesthoods were dedicated to creating illuminated manuscripts, the very
Hmm.
Bibles that would be sent out to those churches.
Hmm.
Those people were parts of very small communities that had a very specific set of training
Hmm.
that most people did not. By bringing about the printing press, even when it started with block printing, which is very time consuming and arduous,
Yes.
even then, um, even just having the proliferation of writing amongst a general populace creates such a huge change. It leads to not only education, but people being able to expand. One of the things that people don't realize that we got out of the Crusades was a reintroduction of classical European science and mathematics and philosophy and histories and things that the Arabic world had held on to
Hmm.
that we had lost during the Dark Ages. And
Hmm.
just that infusion of new knowledge being able to be spread about literally changed our culture. So bringing this back to Wesley, I think
Hmm.
Wesley is part of. I think Wesley is definitely a wonder kid. Like there's something special about him.
Hmm.
But the only way his specialness is possible is if it's taking place in the century that he's living in, because he's allowed access to the engineering section of the most state of the art ship in the galaxy, or at least the most powerful ship and one of the most powerful organizations in the galaxy.
Hmm.
He already has a grasp of science and mathematics that is well beyond anyone his age or us at our ages. Um, I think you only get a Wesley Crusher if you have the world around him to produce it. And I think it's a very. I look at Wesley Crusher being introduced as this wonder kid, and then you know what Picard does when the Traveler finally says, like, "Hey, you need to take real special note of him because he's not like the rest of you. And he's not going to be like the rest of you. He's going to have his own path. He is going to have his own development. And Picard's answer to that is the best way for me to develop a young person is by indoctrinating them in the Starfleet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that just speaks to a very interesting thing about the world we're working in when we talk about Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, did I lose you there?
No. Go ahead. Keep going.
So, I think one thing that Wesley brings to the table is kind of fans get into this real big discussion of Gene's vision and like what Gene Roddenberry's vision is for the show still. And I think it's, I've told you in the past, I think Gene wanted us to look up into the stars and look at them with hope and see not only our future, but, a future out there where we can leave a mark on the galaxy that's a positive one. At the same time, I think part of Gene's vision is seeing a perfected version of ourselves that we kind of just stumble and evolve upon without realizing it. Like, I think Wesley is, as much as people sometimes give Wil Wheaton a lot of crap for being, the nerdy kid on the ship that's always kind of butting in and getting to do things other kids don't, he's the personification of what we want our children to be.
Well, you just said something interesting in that um, about Picard. Once Picard he started to understand from what his observations of Wesley, all the things that he had pulled them out of, on these first few episodes, and then the comments of the Traveler.
Exactly.
And yeah, as an educator, his mechanism, his approach to, well, how can I put Wesley into an environment that's going to advance him, further his education? And you're right. The only thing he had really was Starfleet Academy, along with, making him an acting ensign so that he could, work through all the different departments in the ship. But, thinking ahead a little bit in the episodes, and I don't know which season this occurred, but what happened is that path that Picard suggested for Wesley really wasn't enough.
Yeah.
It ended up not being enough. Wesley had to go out on his own because he was
season
beyond
7.
it. Yeah. Okay. What seasons? He was beyond it.
Well,
So
I think one thing that we kind of also miss in terms of the story of the Wonder Kids, or like even people that are very young when they kind of fall upon their genius, and it's very clear that Wesley's a genius already. And maybe from your generation you'd understand this one, but like Jimi Hendrix dies at what, 25?
something like that. Yeah.
But I think at some point these Wonder Kids come around, and even Mozart dies at a very young age.
Mm-hmm.
I think these kids come around and they're just too far ahead of what they're able to handle because we're too far behind for them. If that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I also like that. I think Picard does the right thing here in terms of finding a structure of support that actually works for the most part. And it's actually something that the boy's interested in and wants to do and wants to be a part of. At the end of this, Wesley just wants to make his mother and ultimately Picard proud. And I think Picard is very wise to recognize and appreciate that. And I think it also says something again about the culture that Wesley's being raised in, where like children, and we've seen this with the crew, like children, the elderly, they all still have value. And if they can show they have value, you use them and you employ them in a way that not only matters but helps engender better growth out of them.
In the fact that Picard is nurturing and mentoring Wesley, does he some degree in the series actually end up fulfilling a role, some degree of a surrogate father?
Yes, and I think part of that is tied into the quasi romance storyline between him and Crusher
Exactly.
that carries
Exactly.
through the entire series.
Right.
I also think that one thing that we don't ever really talk about in terms of fandom is the death of Jack Crusher and how that really is such a big effect on the Crushers and Picard in terms of their characters, but it really isn't ever dealt with except for a few episodes.
Mhm.
I think in some ways Picard helping Wesley is also the redemption of Jean-Luc Picard for losing Jack Crusher
Yes.
while in command of the Pegasus.
Yes.
And it fits in like multiple storylines very well. Where in the very first episode, Encounter at Farpoint, Picard is so scared about making himself look like an ass in front of children that he even
Mhm.
tells Riker, help me avoid this."
Mhm.
And I think Wesley is not only helping him learn how not to be an ass in front of children, it's also helping Wesley find a father figure, in some ways helping Beverly maybe find the surrogate husband figure in a marriage that she needs, because maybe they don't have like a marriage that is ever physically or sexually consummated, but they have a partnership in a way in
Mhm.
terms of taking care of Wesley on while they're both on board.
Mhm.
And it's later revealed that they're often having breakfast together every day. So
Right.
in some ways there's a little bit of a marriage going on between Picard and Crusher anyway.
Mhm.
I think, and then finally, Picard being able to redeem himself over the death of Jack Crusher. I think there's a lot of great things that are done with the Picard Crusher dynamic that really helps the utility of the storytelling.
Yes.
But oh, sorry, go ahead.
Now, I'm just going to say, I think we ought to move on to talk about the space time fault stuff.
Okay, so let's update the people to the general storyline, the listeners at home.
Good idea. Yes.
So the crew is going to pick up Kaczynski and his assistant, known as the Traveler, who is from Tau Alpha Ceti, or at least says he's from Tau Alpha Ceti. And they're very kind of. I do want to make a note, Dad. I wanted to see if you noted this. They note that he is from Tau Alpha Ceti, and they note that Tau Alpha Ceti's far away. But they seem to at least have enough familiarity with it that when they see the Traveler, they're still kind of unfamiliar with him.
Right.
Like it's just kind of a confusing thing to me, where it's like, okay, the Federation's been here, so you would know what these people look like. So the moment the Traveler beams aboard, why is no one going, "Hey, you're not from Tau Alpha Ceti"? Anyway, I just noted that.
Sure.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so Kaczynski comes on board because he has gained some fame after he apparently optimized the engines on the USS Ajax and the Excelsior class USS Fearless, which is dropping him off to the Enterprise. He has apparently caused a new development in warp propulsion, and he is coming aboard the Galaxy class Enterprise D to run an experiment with the help of the crew. So we get into the experiment, and they uh they after Kaczynski kind of resists explaining his formula to Riker and Argyle, because Riker is untrusting of Kaczynski and the Traveler from the very beginning. Um, Kaczynski and his assistant, the Traveler, enter their information as the ship begins to accelerate from warp 1.5. Suddenly, one of the alarms goes off, and Kaczynski shouts to the traveler about an error being made. Outside the ship, the Enterprise engine suddenly engage with a massive burst of speed, and when they come out of it, it's discovered that they have broken warp 10, which means they've broken the warp barrier, and they discover that they are now in the galaxy known as M33, or Triangulum, and LaForge at the helm reports that at maximum warp, it will take them over 300 years to return home.
Right.
So now that we've caught up on everything, I sent you an email a little bit ago that was basically a diagram of all the galaxies that we know in our knowable universe. And try, two million light years away is here. Let me bring this back up. You know what I've noticed with podcasts?
What's that?
Tabs. There's tabs everywhere.
Mm.
Here it is. So Triangulum at lies outside of the 2 million light year boundary. 1 second, I need to deal with Mona real quick.
Okay.
Sorry, folks. We'll be right back. Here, I'm going to pause the recording.
We might describe it as that it's like most of the known galaxies are within, a very.
Here, let me pause you real quick since we started recording again.
All right.
Everyone listening, I'll include a link to the map below that we're looking at. So sorry, Dad, continue.
But looking at this map of the universe as it's known, where the galaxies are, there's a tight cluster. If we use, I guess if we count the Milky Way galaxy at the center, then there's a very tight cluster of galaxies there. And then you go about 2 million to 4 million light years, and there's another big cluster, relatively big cluster of galaxies. And then it starts to spin. It gets very thin when you go out to 5 million, 6 million light years. Now, it's interesting because it comes in a question of, well, are there still galaxies out there whose light hasn't reached us yet for some reason?
Oh, yeah. So there's, in the space that we're looking at, which seems very empty on this map,
right,
over 2 trillion galaxies that are not being shown.
But the thing to kind of jump ahead, because you said in the story when they went to that other galaxy, it was 300. It'd take them 300 years to get back. Did they ever say how far?
They traveled 2,700,000 light years, 700,000 light years.
2,700,000.
Yes.
Well, then the thing that's really amazing as the story goes on, was it when they tried to get back that they had the other incident was really crazy, where they ended up going into this place that they didn't totally understand, but they figured that it was like 1 billion light years from where they started. And according to their chronometer or whatever, that they never surpassed warp 1.5, which gets into, well, what was how did that distance get covered in such a short time?
So, okay, we're actually going to get into a little bit of sci-fi, a little bit of actual science. So the idea behind the warp field is that an engine will create this field around a vehicle that will allow it to basically travel the speed of light or faster. Essentially, it will displace the mass and allow it to move quickly along the space-time curvature of the universe as you're going forward through the galaxy.
And you might say that there are physicists that are actually done some real calculations on this.
Oh yeah, there's actually I think his name is Abricio. He's down in Mexico. He has a legitimate calculation on how to make this happen. The problem is it requires a massive amount of energy. And that gets back to Einstein's theory of relativity. Even to convert, a small amount of mass into light so it can travel at the speed of light just would require a tremendous amount of energy to actually make that conversion possible. So the idea is that the warp core would be able to make a manageable conversion of a vehicle into light. And recently, I don't know if you've watched um, any of Discovery or they've actually improved the graphics of how warp speed looks. So, I people have this idea that warp speed kind of is like the ship jumps really quickly and the ship's moving like as a central object through the solar system or through space. That's not happening at all. What's happening is that it's actually boring itself a tunnel through space in terms of light, and that warp jump is actually jumping through a small tunnel in space that it's creating through this warp field, and it's going from one place to the other. Now, it's still traveling as kind of a relatively solid object, but it's still going from kind of point A to point B. There's a line. You can draw a line, which is why you can use in the show they are able to follow the warp path or whatever field ship leaves behind to
Well,
track it.
we've talked about this before, and I think you understand this better than I, but then how does that compare with the idea of a wormhole,
Well,
which is if you want to get from one part of the galaxy to the other, you don't go in a straight line, you bend space
so
so that you go, the wormhole gives you the shortcut.
I was getting right to that. So
Okay.
the obvious opposite of this, often in sci-fi, is something called the hyperdrive. And what the hyperdrive does is what, as you described, is this bending. So we know that the universe and space in general is flat. Like physicists have proven that our space and our known material universe is flat. So essentially, what a hyperdrive would do would take this flat universe and not actually physically bend it, but the ship would be able to basically take the universe and bend it and curve it to where, let's say, you drew a line down the universe and your left side is A, your left side's B, and you pick a point on A and you stuck a pencil through it.
Well, yeah, it's like if you wanted to go from America to China, you just be able to dematerialize yourself and go right through the earth, because that's really the shortest distance.
Okay, it's basically like digging a hole through the earth to get from America to China.
Right.
But instead it's kind of like you're blinking
Right.
through that hole. The thing that this episode puts forward is that Kaczynski thinks, and he even boasts at one point, like, I've broken the warp barrier, and you're going to have to find a new scale of measurement called the Kaczynski scale to measure how fast things go.
Right.
Because they're still working within the physical idea of, okay, we can make an object move from point A to point B at a rate of speed that supersedes time and space. Because that's essentially what warp speed does. It supersedes time and space. It creates a pocket where those things don't affect you. But the thing is, outside of the warp bubble, the foreseeable universe is still going on.
Come back to one thing you just said about the universe being flat, because when you look at this map that you pulled up that you're going to put into the podcast so people can look at it, that diagram, it seems like there's also there's an X, Y, and a Z axis. So
we know,
like all of the planets in the solar system are pretty much on the same plane. But does that mean that all the galaxies, galaxies are, there's some spherosity, if there's such a word, to the galaxies in the universe, isn't there?
So that gets into the more difficult question: is there a floor and ceiling to the universe? And that gets into the difficult question: is there a boundary to the universe at all? Because the truth is, there is no foreseeable edge to the universe. We can see out
Well,
to 10 billion years of light.
but mathematically, doesn't that make sense? Because if you have a
Yes.
line, or even if it's a, an X, Y, and Z axis, if you go on the X axis to the right, 1, 2, 3, it goes to infinity.
Yeah.
And if you go to zero and you go the other direction to the negative numbers, it goes to infinity. And the same would occur in any vector going through that center,
So what
any
this
line going through that center.
so we are now dealing with the very difficult what I like to call the magical minutia of Star Trek. Because on one
Yes.
hand, there's some scientific things going on here. On one hand, like let's get back to Kaczynski's idea that he's broken the warp barrier. The idea behind, so usually in Star Trek, when you break the warp barrier, it's a very dangerous thing, and it usually tears the ship apart because the ship can't maintain its warp bubble if it breaks the warp barrier, and it's usually warp 10. Like every ship, and you'll note this if you watch the show, with an eye of like really studying the technological aspects of Starfleet. Like they're always trying to get the ships to warp 10 but not above it, because they know that's where their barrier is. If they go above warp 10, the thing's going to shear apart, or it's going to break some temporal, it's going to create some sort of temporal anomaly in space. So like um the USS Defiant in Deep Space Nine, I think it can go to warp 9.75, and
Mhm.
that's considered a really big deal. Um, and the Enterprise D is a big deal because it can hit warp 9.9, and I think multiple times it hits warp 10. But the point I'm trying to make is that when Kaczynski breaks this scale and he says you're going to have to come up with a Kaczynski scale, this is an important piece of like astrophysics and science, especially when it comes to propulsion. I don't think that gets a lot of attention paid to it. Um, we are still dealing with the idea that we have to kind of essentially slingshot ourselves in an object in a direction, maybe a controlled maybe it's a controlled flight and we can break it and we can change direction, but we still have to throw ourselves forward to make things work. Kaczynski is still of the belief that space and time is material, and that to make things work you have to achieve speed and inertia and momentum to control the travel of it. What this episode puts forth is that Kaczynski is worried about a false thing. It's not actually about how fast you go in the object. It's about where you think, and it's about who you are, what you think you are, and where you think you are in terms of being able to really manipulate time and space. And this gets into the very difficult subject of quantum mechanics and quantum theory. Because on one hand, the episode's dealing with the physical reality of the ship being lost in a galaxy that is so far from home that there's no possible way they're ever going to survive long enough to see their friends or family again. Which gets back to something you pointed out um, during the very first episode we recorded about Encounter at Farpoint. This is the first ship that has families on it. It has over 1,000 people on it that include entire families and civilians. It's not just the crew of the Enterprise and the Starfleet officers who've been thrown over 27 mil. I'm sorry,
2.7
2.7
million.
million miles away from home. It's families too. It's families and it's children who will not make the 300-year journey back home.
Well, then it
So
gets to
there,
again, when they get to that second place where it's all those funny lights, looks like they're under. It almost
well,
reminded me of there being under the Arctic ice, and they're a billion light years.
well,
I
like
mean,
I I'm glad you bring this up because we're getting to the question of, okay, the crude Kaczynski thinks that he can make the same occurrence, uh, getting them to Triangulum, happen again in terms of getting them back home, and he wears out the Traveler doing it. and where they end up is where they essentially identify it as the edge of the universe. But as you and I just discussed, there really is no edge of the universe. So where are they? They're in a place where space and time can intersect with thought. And this is where we get a lot of interesting character building in terms of seeing how everyone's thoughts kind of coalesce before them and materialize in this kind of realm where the psychological can become manifest. But let's stick to like the question that you're asking, or at least the one I think you're asking. Um, what does this realm say that they end up in?
The other, I don't know. I mean, what comes out of this for me is if thought can have an effect on space and time, can it actually have an effect on matter? And to go a little further, when I was watch these episodes twice. I
Mm-hmm.
think you do the same thing. I watched the first one just to get the story, and then I go back and since I'm familiar with it, I take notes, and I've got some ideas, and they coalesce the second time. Is when they were trying to get out of what they thought was the edge of the galaxy to back where their origin. Picard says everybody has to think good thoughts to support the traveler. And I'm thinking, is he really saying that everybody has to pray for the traveler? And it makes me think about, is it really talking about
I'm nodding vigorously. Yes.
prayer? And is it saying that, in this taking this from science fiction, is there actually some validity that prayer can have an effect? Or if you have enough people thinking something that they want something to happen, can it actually have some sort of effect on matter or effect on how things evolve?
So, our ancestors, your ancestors and mine were Celts, and they had this very deep-seated belief in the other world. And to them, the other world was not like this far distant realm. It was literally kind of like this dimensional space that was kind of separated our world, the material realm, and their realm by this kind of veil that we didn't see, but it was
Mhm.
there, and if you could perceive it, you were able to traverse the two.
And that's even in modern poetry, the veil of
Yeah,
between life and death and so forth.
I think one thing that, and, kind of getting back to this warp barrier thing that I was talking about. Um, I think when Kaczynski and the Traveler break warp 10 and get them the triangulum, and then they break it again and get them to this edge of the universe, I think what they actually are doing are breaking the dimensional veil between the material reality that the ship's in, because the ship the first time jumps to M33 or Triangulum. That's a real place. Um, but I think, what if the second place they jump to when the Traveler's wounded the second time during the jump? What if that is outside of the actual physical dimension, and where they end up is kind of the next place over? It's in our universe, but it's on the other side of the veil in our universe. Like,
It's
what if
not a it's not a parallel universe. It's a different state of reality. It's a different state of existence.
what if like the mistake in the equation that the Traveler and Kaczynski make ends them up in the galactic version of the other world, where our thoughts can generate the Targ from our childhood, as we see with Worf,
Oh yes, that's right. That's
or
right.
it can
That's right.
generate the cat that we remember, the cat that we loved dearly when we were trying to stay away from these horrific rape gangs of Tasha Yar.
Right.
Or, Picard, in a very fascinating scene,
Oh,
sees his
that was.
mother
Yes.
and even asks, like, where are we? And she even says,
Yes.
does it matter where, she's kind of like, does it matter where you are? You're at a place where you can basically have anything.
That was a very interesting conversation. Yes.
And I think, like, maybe we're asking the wrong questions as fans and as viewers when we're asking, like, where in the universe did they end up? Maybe they didn't end up anywhere. Maybe they just jumped to the other side of the veil.
Well, that fits in with it. They said that they never exceeded warp 1.5.
And when they finally are able to, like, help the traveler with their positive thoughts, and, as you noted, prayer, get back to where they originally were, it gets into the question of where did they really go anywhere at all in the first place?
Right.
So it gets into the question of, getting back to warp drive, hyperdrive, and then this kind of quantum mechanics and this quantum reality we've been discussing. You know, warp drive is still kind of maybe like the Stone Age of travel. You're still having to just fling someone from point A to B. Hyperdrive is where you bend the universe and you punch a hole through it, and you end up from A22 to B22.
Well, and then you go back to look at Q.
Yeah.
What realm? What is the realm? The actual realm that the Q exist in?
And they touch on that in Voyager, and they actually touch into more of, what the actual existence of the Q continuum's like. But I think, and I think it gets back, weirdly circling back to Wesley Crusher. you know Q says in the encounter of far at during the encounter at Farpoint, like, humans aren't ready. That might be fear on Q's end, because he sees people like Wesley Crusher who might actually be ready to make the leap between the kind of impermanent physical boundary that we're all dealing with to actually exploring the cosmos in a way that, you know Q can Q can exist both in the physical and non-physical realm, and he can appear wherever he want to. Space and time are thought to him.
And then there's the other question in regard to this is once they're being propelled back from the billion year light years away edge of the universe,
Mm-hmm.
and it is the traveler with the positive thoughts of the crew that causes that to happen. Where does the traveler end up? And the travel, because he disappears, correct?
Yeah, he doesn't
And,
die.
and he doesn't die, and he actually describes himself as wanting to just travel and see different things, and which is also learn different things. So obviously, when he goes into that phasing mode, he's in a completely different, you know, physical and quantum state from where everybody else around him is.
Exactly. Well, like, I think one thing that I never considered until I started watching the show again for this show with you, um, we deal with a lot of extratemporal beings, not even extraterrestrial, but extratemporal beings who reside outside of time. Um, I think, we now have two characters, potentially three with Wesley, but we now have two characters in terms of the Q and the Traveler, who, kind of break the bounds of the definition of God in terms of being in some ways being able to be omnipotent, omniscient, and at the same time not have to be bound by the worries of a physical reality. They're kind of immutable because the traveler doesn't die. He just travels along. I think what the show is sometimes proposing is this idea that, these people really are raw. This crew we're dealing with really are raw explorers still on a raw frontier. Like, for all the technological advancement that they've achieved, there's still so much farther that they could go that they haven't. And I think that these characters are there to remind us of that. And episodes like this, where we go to realms like the quote unquote end of the universe, are here to remind us that, like, even with these huge technological leaps, we still have so far to go in terms
It's
of our own interspatial development.
it's not just a matter of being explorers in the physical sense of going into interstellar and intergalactic space, but it's also into metaphysical and eschatological space.
Absolutely. And the truth is, like, if you look at the Traveler, and if you look at Q, and if you look at kind of the idea of time and Star Trek being very permeable and in some ways myriad, um, maybe an eschatological viewpoint is no longer necessary, because eschatology is the study of ends. What if there are no ends?
The ultimate meanings, yes, right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I just think about this because since I went to a Jesuit college in the 70s, and that was a time when the uh, French Jesuit philosopher Teilhard de Chardin came, uh, was popularly read and
Hmm.
taught. And one of his key books was called Christology and Evolution, which really gets into the idea that, expanding on the idea that Christ is the Alpha and Omega, that his theory, his premise, and I don't understand it well, I have to admit, is that, the universe is toward what Christ stands for, what he represents. And, um, but he was a physicist also. So I just mentioned that because that's a whole different discussion from looking at first season one of Star Trek Next Generation. But, it fits into that whole thing of, what, what really is, have we really even scratched the surface of reality?
Well, I think one thing that I was looking at today, for some reason, I wanted to look at the story of Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card.
No, I've
So,
heard of it, but I don't know the story.
so it's a very popular science fiction novel that came out in the 70s. It's been classified as a children's novel at some points, but it was basically a Vietnam novel where they take these children and they train them up to basically run these kind of automated armies against this bug army that's out in the universe that's fighting humans, and that's trying to invade our solar system. It's very much like Starship Troopers,
I'm just going to say, yeah,
but
right.
instead of Starship Troopers, like, it's all being done essentially with drone ships.
Huh.
Um, and I think kind of that is more likely our immediate future, where in terms of space travel, where we actually don't send our physical selves there in terms of like a human presence. We actually send drones. And I think that gets into a very I think it gets into a very interesting evolutionary concept for humans of, and it gets back into where I mentioned previously about ontology. Are we ourselves? Are we the things that we design? Or are we in turn the things that our designs design upon us? It
Well,
are let me just get
no, I know where you're going. Go ahead and finish. Yeah.
um if we sent like an army of drones out into the solar system and we never actually went there, haven't we still gone there? It gets into the
That
existential question of what does it mean to be human and what does it mean to actually reach out as a
that
human.
that discussion, I read an article about that recently, where does it make more sense to send robots, artificial intelligent entities that I guess you could say represent us because they're under our control, or we hope they're under our control,
Yeah.
out into interplanetary or particular interstellar space, because, I just, thinking about this, I think that we still need to figure out how, if we want to, I mean, we could colonize the moon, possibly. We could go to Mars. We might be able to go to Venus. We might go to some of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. But we still don't know whether physiologically we could adapt to the space travel and the new environment and so on.
Well, there's that big layer of radiation out there.
Yes.
Radiation out there that not a lot of people talk about.
But, but in terms of, let's just say that if we figure that out so that we go to Mars or the moons of Saturn, Titan or whatever. But when you get to interstellar, because of the technology we have right now, and until we figure out how to do warp drive, or if that just remains science fiction, because of the time involved to do interstellar travel, or we actually already started at that, but because the Voyagers are going out into interstellar space, surprisingly, their plutonium power source still gives them enough energy to send a minimum amount of data back. So is that how we're really going to explore space? Unless, and we've talked about this a little bit, what are UFOs? Are they transdimensional travelers? Have they figured this stuff out? Are they even from the future? I think we talked about that in a previous podcast even.
Yeah. Are they flinging themselves forward, or are they punching a hole?
Right.
Or are they just phasing in and out?
Right.
Because getting to this question of like temporal mechanics and time travel and going back and forth, I think that would be more of a phasing in or out than it would be kind of a popping a hole or flinging something like warp. I think the question you ask has so many different variables to consider inside of it. I think that if we, you brought up Voyager, and they actually deal with this idea in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, because V'ger comes back as Voyager runs into a technologically advanced civilization that modifies it and returns it so it can like communicate with its original maker. Us.
But it's a machine civilization, correct?
It's the Borg. No, seriously, I think it's the Borg. I have a theory. I think there's a part of us that's always going to want to actually go out there and do the exploring ourselves. I think when you look at certain things like Elon Musk's Neuralink, which, while I'm not the biggest Elon Musk fan, the idea of downloading your consciousness or uploading it into a supercomputer means that you can theoretically transport your consciousness. So the idea of, even the idea of like, what does it mean to actually physically go out there and explore something? If your consciousness is on a super microchip that's on top of a space deck that is, going past Jupiter, are you going past Jupiter? Like,
Oh, I just thought of one movie that really addresses this thing of thought is the movie Lucy.
Oh yeah. Oh, Lucy's a great one. I think Lucy too kind of deals with, we should probably put a name to the thing that we're talking about here, because it's really what we're talking about in Star Trek. Transhumanism. The idea of moving past our physical our physical bounds as humans, and kind of redefining humanity as something that goes beyond this physical thing. I'm holding up my hand for the camera for people at home, but what it means to be human would not be bound by flesh and blood.
And there are a number of different species that in the Star Trek stories they meet that exist in that way. They're pure energy.
Yeah, exactly. But they're still able to like communicate and understand things on some sort of human level. There's going to be an episode, I think it's season 2, but it's called Home Soil, where they go to this planet where there's this terraforming project going on, and what they discover is that there's this saltwater layer under the soil, and there's actually a non-organic life form living under the soil in this saltwater layer. And what the terraforming project's been doing has been sucking up the saltwater layer and killing this basically civilization of non-organic beings. And these organics feel fear, and they feel pain, and they reproduce, and they even communicate with the crew of the Enterprise by evolving to the point where they can use the universal translator, something we should probably talk about in a later show. But they even get to evolve to where they understand concepts of things like war and genocide and peace, and certain people being responsible for things and certain people not, and being able to make peace and have forgiveness and have a certain sense of magnanimity and grace about it. I think what we're all ultimately talking about when we talk about us traveling outside the bounds of time and space, using thought, is, I guess, ultimately we're trying to find our greater selves by going out there. And maybe we go out there with a drone, and maybe it's our drone with our consciousness uploaded onto it. Or maybe it's us flinging ourselves in a massive spaceship one day.
Well, I think it's just all part of evolution. I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at the supposed history of the species, that the environmental conditions, 100,000 or so years ago, that there may have been as few as 6,000 humans in some degree left in East Africa, and they were able to cross the Red Sea and got into the Arabian Peninsula, and then from there conditions were better, and they were smart enough to figure out how to survive, so that they then spread, with East Africa being the cradle of the human species. Once they got out of Africa, then they went everywhere.
Do you know what I think?
And it's an exploratory thing. They were explorers.
Yeah.
But it was evolution, because they experienced new environments and they had to adjust. They needed to adjust to different climates, to different animals, to different sources of food, to different plants as hunter gatherers, and so on.
Thinking in new ways.
Yes, exactly.
Do you know why I think ultimately we as humans will probably develop something like warp drive and fling ourselves into space?
Why is that?
And it's kind of a weird tangent, but Andy Weir's novel The Martian, and even the Matt Damon movie really gave me hope that that we as humans will be able to physically explore space one day. Do you know why?
Go ahead.
That entire novel is about us being in the most inhospitable environment possible, and through our smarts and thinking things in a new way, not only surviving, in some cases thriving, but ultimately outsmarting the nature itself.
Well, just what we're talking about, how those 6,000 humans, or a subset of them, were smart enough to get out of East Africa.
Exactly. I think that we as a species are smart enough that we will be able to figure this out. But I also think as a species, and maybe that this episode where no one's gone before, is proposing, is that the next real frontier is not maybe where we go physically, but how we get there. And how we get there may not involve the physical at all.
Does that get into sort of the spiritual realm, or what we would define as the spiritual realm now?
And this gets into the difficult question of scientific philosophy. in science, there's this real hesitance to explore the spiritual because it's very hard to take quantitative result of the spiritual. Um, you ha- and it's kind of like Kaczynski saying after
Experimental design doesn't fit. Yeah.
exactly. I think one of the problems that we have with science when dealing with the spirit, and I've actually dealt with this in my own career, when it comes to actually bringing the science into matters of the spirit, we don't have a Kaczynski scale. We just don't have, and science is very very hesitant to even attempt to uh, create such a scale because I think
Mhm.
on one hand it wants solid proof and solid data that it can use and experiment with and replicate over and over again to at least prove the theory. But like, let's take the idea of magic, which is a very applicable idea here in this episode because
It is.
ultimately they
Yes.
move to a realm of pure magic.
Right.
Um, we've known for a while that like meditation can have real biological positive effects on the human body. But we but beyond that, we don't want to make any real measure on what kind of psychological or spiritual effects that it takes because truthfully, we don't have a measure for that. That's why psychology is still a social science and not like an actual hard science. Um, I think the scientific community, and I say this as someone who believes in secular values and believes in the scientific method and actually doing all of this data collecting, actually looking at the data and determining the truth from the data, not from belief.
Hmm.
I think the only way you actually deal with these beliefs in a serious way is by developing the methods and tools and scales to actually deal with them. And I think you're never going to get it from religion because religion just doesn't have the ability to look at it objectively. It
Hmm.
can't look at
Hmm.
itself and go, "Oh, look how we're fucking idiots." It can't do it. Sorry,
Yeah.
Ben, I'm using the F word, but you'll hear it many times as you grow up.
Right.
um, but you can't expect religion to do it because religion just can't look at itself objectively. Because if it did, it would, in most cases, that religion wouldn't last if it had to look at itself objectively.
Well, your mother and I had a conversation along those lines driving back from Rayford today, and
Well,
we
here,
were
let me stop recording if we're going to have this because we're still
no,
recording the
we
show.
can do that later. We can do that
Okay.
later.
But, I think one thing that we still have to explore in terms of the human frontier is our inner space. And I
Hmm.
think we need to develop the tools and the methodologies to actually go there and explore it in an objective sense. And that means re exploring some things that I think science is going to be really uncomfortable dealing with, like ritual magic, ceremonial magic,
Well, see,
magical
you
altars.
bring up a good point because we're talking about Star Trek and we're talking about going out into the larger universe.
Yes.
When you talk about quantum mechanics and quantum physics, you're really getting down to talking about what matter is made of, what are atoms made of, what are subatomic particles, and it gets into the whole thing that the Higgs boson is brought up, referring it to as the God particle and so forth.
Well,
It's the thing that makes everything stick together.
well, even then, like even the Higgs boson, one thing that does away with this entire spiel I just had about us needing to like actually scientifically investigate magic. All of this could be a simulation.
Well, but the thing is, what I was saying is when we need to, you said something that we need to look at in inner space.
Yes.
That's when you look at, if you have a subatomic particle, how far can you break it down until you've got elementary, elementary particle, or is there such a thing? Because all these particles are wavicles anyway. Their matter and their energy.
Well, kind of getting back to propulsion through space. One issue that we have in terms of being able to really figure out how to propel ourselves through space is dealing with the idea of gravitons. We don't really know how to measure gravity in the universe.
No, we
We
haven't
know
figured
it's
that out yet.
we know
Right.
that it's there. We know
Right.
gravity's there. We know these gravitons are there. But in terms of actually measuring them and figuring out how they connect to the universe itself in terms of the actual makeup, and this gets into quantum mechanics because I think these things are attached. How our physical bodies, yours and mine, we grew up with the biological fact that it's made of 70% water. The truth is, and this is the thing that I don't think a lot of people want to deal with, the majority of our body is made up of empty space.
Electron density.
Yeah, it's just it's just dense electrons, but for the most part, it's empty space. Dealing with that kind of notion that you're essentially walking around as nothing, just a condensed amount of electrons. And if you get down to the real subatomic level with all that, I think what you discover is kind of the same thing that you're going to discover when we finally figure out gravitons, is that all of this stuff is I think you get hyperdrive before you get warp drive, because I think it's easier to figure out how to move things from point A22 to B22 because you can think it easier. Like you'll be able to. I know at this point it sounds like gibberish, and maybe this show sounds like gibberish to some people listening. But I think one thing that will happen in the future of space propulsion is that there will be kind of a psychological and mental component to all this. They kind of played with the idea of it in Wing Commander in terms of having pilgrim pilots, people that were able to somehow make it through the transition of faster than light travel and still pilot. Because I don't know if you ever read Frank Herbert's Dune.
No.
So in Frank Herbert's Dune, there's this thing called the spice or the melange, which is what turns the character's eyes blue. And what it does is when you take the spice, you can navigate the barrier. You can get past the barrier that would otherwise cause you physical death or sickness. I can't remember, but you take this drug and you're actually able to travel at the speed of light. It physically allows you to do it. I think the future of space travel will require humans to integrate some sort of mental or psychological aspect. And, this may get back into the idea of us transferring our consciousness into technology.
Mm-hmm.
But, and, on a quantum level, I think if you are able to transfer your consciousness into a piece of technology, you're going to have something on the level of a quantum computer to do it. Because what is consciousness, ultimately?
Right.
And on that note, Dad, is there anything you would like to add?
No, I just think at some point, one of the things we should get into in a future episode of the podcast is what the hell is subspace? How they can communicate when they're, light years from Starfleet headquarters in San Francisco. They had to make some science fiction up to get past this thing that, we know that it takes 14 minutes to send something, or I don't know how long, 40 minutes to send a message to Mars via radio waves and get it back to communicate with one of the things roaming around on the red planet. So how can they have a Zoom meeting with Picard and the Admiral in San Francisco?
So there's an entire different realm of science fiction propulsion called slip space, and it deals with what you just talked about, because subspace is a real thing here in our universe.
Well, then we have to at some point have maybe a special podcast about that, perhaps.
Absolutely. But here, before we go, let me just tell you what slip space is.
Okay.
So basically, there is this layer of subspace in our universe where energy travels, and certain electromagnetic energies are able to travel um, throughout the universe, kind of in a larger network.
Hmm.
Let me make sure I'm not screwing this up. Yeah, it's basically the vectors of electromagnetic energy throughout the universe.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, at least in sci-fi, by the way, what I'm talking about, this is all sci-fi. I'm not talking about actual physics. So essentially what happens in these subspace sci-fis is that you punch a hole in the subspace, you sink your ship in the subspace, it flattens out. You essentially shoot across the subspace barrier and you pop out at where you expected to go. So it's kind of like flinging an object with warp drive, but you're just greasing the wheels.
Hmm.
So
Well, yeah, we'll talk about that more because I can figure
so
that out.
so before we go, Dad, one more time, do, what do you think of the episode? And yeah, just in general, what do you think of the episode?
I think it was a very good exercise because it's brought up, when you really think about it, and if you have, you know, understand a little bit about quantum mechanics and the physical aspects and, you know, just what really happened, this whole thing of space, time, and thought. How did they make these big jumps in distances and, almost instantaneously? And, the whole thing, I think the really, even if someone sees the episode and they aren't interested in quantum mechanics and quantum physics and that sort of thing, I think the whole thing that might capture some people's interest is what happened when the crew of the Enterprise had to put these positive thoughts, these prayer-like thoughts, to make the traveler successful, getting them back home.
I yeah, like you, I like the cohesiveness of this episode, but I also like
It
how it
is.
deals with the idea that, our thoughts have a greater impact on the whole than we even suspect.
Mhm.
And I think that this is a really well produced, tightly directed, well acted story with a lot of great characters. Like Kaczynski's a great heel, and the Traveler's a really good mysterious character.
Yes,
But I think you both and I agree. It's just a really nice episode that deals with a
it
lot
is.
of really heady stuff in a fun way.
It does. Absolutely.
So on that, we will see everyone next time for
It
the Lonely
is
Among Us.
The Lonely Among Us, correct.
So we'll
Yes.
see you all next time. Dad, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Jay. It was fun.
Everyone, this has been Where No Bubs Has Gone Before. See you all later.